John
Yes.
Wyndham and the Cosy Catastrophe. Right, it was a massive bestseller, published in 1951, just as the Cold War was getting more dangerous and the certainties of British society were rapidly crumbling. So little knew then. Wyndham gave us a new word. I mean, even today, I actually have heard people in garden centres look at a large, intimidating plant and say, "My God, that's a Triffid." And I did see in I can't remember which newspaper, but some random article began with some reference to Triffids. So it's clearly in the public imagination. It's a book that's never, I think, been out of print since it was published, and it has some uncanny, disturbing resonances with today's world. So this is a bit where I do the academic thing and say trigger warning. You know, I'm going to try to put in a few jokes, but it's not actually a book about a nice escapist thing. It's really about the disturbing elements of our world. So, what do people understand by science fiction? Well, I'm not going to give a lecture. This isn't a lecture I give on science fiction, but just a few instances of what we think of science fiction comes from a series of what my friend Paul Kincaid, who writes about this stuff, calls braids. Things which are intertwined, and you can kind of take one of them out and it's still a braid. And you can put another bit of twine or hair or whatever it is, and it's still a braid. So you should see on the screen our Chester connection with science fiction. John Wilkins, who became Bishop of Chester in 1668. Can we see that? Someone wave and say yes, please.
Yes, we can all see that. Yes.
Right. Yes. This came out of, I guess, the post-Copernicus realization that the Earth was not the center of the universe, that the moon and the sun and the planets and the stars did not revolve around the Earth. And Galileo, in I think it was 1610, looking through his telescope and seeing that Jupiter had moons, and these planet things look pretty much, like the moon, and the moon could be a planet, could be a world. And so John Wilkins, he published a book about the discovery of a world in the moon. It could be another habitable world. And he updated it a few years later with the suggestion that given the right technology, we could actually go there. So that's kind of one element in science fiction, this idea that there are other worlds out there, we might be able to go there. Another is kind of anxieties about the future. This is the voyages to the moon, other voyages to the moon, including Cyrano de Bergerac and another bishop, Francis Godwin, who had his character going to the moon by harnessing geese. So when we see skeins of geese flying over the D estuary, just sort of grab a few and they might take you to the moon. Other element, though, was the anxieties about the future war scenarios. George Chesney's Battle of Dorking in 1871 kind of kicked this off. Anxieties about the state of the British Army in 1871, when Prussia was just marching into Paris. Could enemy forces take us over as easily as that? And he and a bunch of other people suggested yes. And suddenly every nation in Europe was writing these future war things in which the neighboring country invaded them and was either thrown out by some item of gosh wow new technology, or they were rapidly and humiliatingly defeated. And this was kind of culminated by H.G. Wells with The War of the Worlds, in which the Martians shattered the complacency of the late Victorian British Empire by invading Britain. Also, more science fictionally, the effect of new technologies, and this is where Mary Shelley's Frankenstein comes in. Mary Shelley attended lectures by people like Humphrey Davy, and people who are doing experiments on how you might be able to create life by putting electric currents through living tissue, watching frogs' legs twitch. And part of Frankenstein very much is this idea of a guy with a new technology and what might be the kind of effects, both physical and moral, of that new technology. Frankenstein creates life, and then he really has a kind of responsibility which he tries to evade for what we call the monster, the creature, who is not, but at least at the start of the novel, is not an evil being. One of my favorite writers, Jane Webb, basically stole from Mary Shelley. She stole the idea of the galvanic battery creating life. She stole one of Mary Shelley's other ideas, ballooning, which Shelley had in her novel The Last Man. She has a character whose friend is ill in Edinburgh, so the friend says, "We must take the next balloon to Edinburgh." And she also has these amazing kind of bizarre Gothic steam-powered weather control machines and plows and things, which so attracted the horticultural expert John Claudius Loudon that he asked one of his friends to introduce him to this ingenious young man who'd come up with these ideas, and was a little bit nonplussed to find out that this young man was in fact a woman. And a few months later, they married. That's the story as she tells it. I'm kind of working on an edition of The Mummy at the moment, and it's quite clear that she's kind of making a lot of this up as she goes along. It's a bit more complicated than that. But to the right of this, we have a Victorian print called The March of Intellect, which all these fantasies about what the world could be like in the future. There could be channel tunnels and flights and automobiles. These things that will never, of course, happen. And of course, another element is the utopia, the perfect world, or as Thomas More called it, utopia, which is a pun in the Greek, good place, no place, the perfect place that doesn't actually exist. And this idea that we could actually change the world for the better becomes part of science fiction, or part of this developing form of literature. Charlotte Perkins Gilman's Herland, a feminist dystopia, feminist utopia. William Morris's News from Nowhere, which has Morris himself kind of dreaming into the future of this world that's created by, we come to discover, the words of William Morris. And it's a really interesting novel, and it's written very much as a kind of riposte to Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward, and its much more regimented state socialist future. Bellamy again has his character waking up into a future Boston. Just a little sideshow here. The foodstuff that's named after something in science fiction. Bulwer Lytton's The Coming Race in 1871 has this, it's a kind of semi-utopia, an underground advanced race of people who are powered or have harnessed this mysterious energy force called vril. Some marketing genius decided to combine that term with this yeast or meat extract that he'd invented, and called it bovril. And of course, we still have it today. That's a kind of digression. I mentioned dystopias earlier on. Dystopia is the reverse, I guess, of utopia, the bad place. And here we have a number of examples. The Russian writer Evgeny Zamyatin, 1924, I think, published. It was never, or I think it possibly has been now, but for much of the 20th century was not ever published in Russia because it was aimed at attacking the Stalinist cult of personality. Became very influential on George Orwell's 1984, certainly, which is the dystopia which I guess we always refer to nowadays. War is peace, ignorance is whatever it goes, freedom is slavery, and Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. Huxley never admitted to have read Zamyatin. Orwell certainly did, very much acknowledged that his 1984 was based on Zamyatin's work. And again, towards the end of the century, I have already mentioned H.G. Wells. In 1894, trying to persuade the Pall Mall Gazette to take him on as a book reviewer, Wells met the editor, who said to him, "Well, you're educated in science." Wells actually was the first major writer to be educated in science rather than the classics or literature generally. Said, "You're interested in science. Why don't you write something which will reflect that knowledge and explore subject matter that other authors don't have access to?" So he started writing a series of short stories. I think the first one was called A Stolen Bacillus, and they were published by the Pall Mall Gazette, or Pall Mall Budget, which was the kind of supplement to it, and it kicked him off as a major novelist. And Wells, I think, really created with these novels, first Men in the Moon and The Time Machine, and this extract from A Story of the Days to Come, with these moving walkways and massive projected cinema screens. Wells really developed the main ideas of modern science fiction. And of course, we have the American pulps. Hugo Gernsback, Luxembourg Jewish immigrant to the United States, puffed this new sort of magazine in amazing stories. He talked about the Jules Verne, H.G. Wells, Edgar Allan Poe sort of story. Charming romance intermingled with scientific fact and prophetic vision. And you can see on the masthead here, extravagant fiction today, cold fact tomorrow. And what Gernsback really tried to get his readers to become involved with this idea that you could be inspired by reading this sort of fiction to actually go and invent these weird things in the stories, and you could become the Thomas Alva Edison of the future. So that's the lecture that I wasn't going to give. And now let's look at John Wyndham and the Day of the Triffids. John Wyndham Parks Lucas Bain and Harris, to give his full name, born in 1903. His father was a barrister. His mother was the daughter of a Birmingham ironmaster. It wasn't a happy marriage. The family separated when Wyndham, or Jack, John Bain, wherever we call him, was 8. I'll use Wyndham as the term that people know him by. He spent 3 years at various schools before entering Bedales, which is a kind of progressive liberal boarding school, which is still around today and still very proud of the connection with John Wyndham. He tried various unsuccessful attempts at a career, law, farming, advertising, and he began to write for various periodicals. And as John Bainin, or John Bainin Harris, he published fiction in the American pulps from the early 1930s. And his first published piece was actually a slogan: "Future Flying Fiction." It was the slogan for Air Wonder Stories, an early pulp magazine. They had a competition to create a sort of slogan that would attract readers. Unfortunately, by the time the competition was judged, the magazine had folded, and this was actually published in its sister magazine, Wonder Stories. But he won the competition, and probably at the strength of that started submitting stories. And his first story, Worlds to Barter, was published in Wonder Stories. A number of other things followed. Stowaway to Mars, a novel. The Secret People, which is first serialized in a British magazine called The Passing Show. Stowaway to Mars was published as a novel by under the title Planet Plane. And Foul Play Suspected, which is a detective story, which I've never actually managed to track down to read, but I'm told it uses some of his experiences in the advertising industry. So by 1937, he was already described as the best of our modern science fiction authors in a British fanzine. And he was a well-known writer under this name in these magazines. Sadly, 10-story fantasy, Tyrant and Slave Girl on Planet Venus, has no tyrant, no slave girl, no whipping, but I'm sure that cover attracted a lot of readers. It was published under a more sedate title in New Worlds Science Fiction, and he's published under the several stories in the short-lived British science fiction magazines Tales of Wonder and Fantasy. Then came the war. During World War II, Wyndham served in the civil service and in the signals when he was finally called up. He saw action in Normandy. Judging by some of his stories and some of his later writing, actual, quite serious action. His wartime experiences come across in a letter, or a series of letters, which he wrote to Grace Wilson, a school teacher whom he met when they were both living in the Pen Club in London. The Pen Club it was run by the Society of Friends, aka the Quakers, although neither Wyndham nor Grace Wilson were actual kind of religious Quakers. The Pen Club was very much used as a sort of boarding house for somewhat impecunious middle-class people in London at the time. Amy Binns recently published a biography of Wyndham, The Hidden Wyndham, which I have here. It's very good. She quotes this first letter, which I will read to you. It's probably a bit faint on the screen. This is dated 3rd of September 1939. Darling, the announcement came a few minutes ago. I was wrong. I never thought it would. But what is somehow most wrong is that we didn't hear it together. I don't know where you are at present, but I shall post this as soon as I know your address. I hope that you are safe and as comfortable as circumstances allow. As for me, well, I don't know yet. Just in case, darling, sweet. Thank you, darling, sweet. It has meant more than I ever knew. Love, darling, from Jack. Now, I don't know about anybody here, but to me, that's kind of over sentimental and cloying, and yet I think kind of very genuine. You know, people hearing at that time that the country was about to be plunged into the second major war of the century. They must have been, you know, feeling very much like that, and there must have been hundreds and thousands of communications and letters like that all around the country. So I think that's a very interesting insight into Wyndham, and the letters. There are at least 50 of them, I think. Contain vivid descriptions of air raids in wartime London, and they express his emotional turmoil during the war years. His brother Vivian actually had a nervous breakdown after serving as a fire warden. And in many ways, these letters form the transition between John Bainham Harris and John Wyndham. And the Wyndham archives also have birthday cards and letters in these Valentines, which he sent to his wife, Grace. Now listen, Muse, we've only 2 more days. You can't afford to linger in decline. It's most important that we find new ways to tell our sweet about St. Valentine. I think when Liverpool University bought the John Wyndham archive, while I was there, discovering these was one of the joys. It was very much a sort of personal touch, I think. So during the war, Wyndham began to write and publish the occasional science fiction, but like many, he was profoundly affected. And attempting to rebuild his career after the war, he hit upon the idea of combining 2 disaster scenarios, which first came to him. But before that, he attempted a kind of thriller, a kind of detective thriller. Tried to marry the detective thriller with the science fiction mode in this Plan for Chaos, which was about clone Nazis attempting to bring back a Third World War. It wasn't published until David Ketterer and I published it in 29. Here is our version, and here is the Penguin version. It's still in print. It's not a terrific novel, I have to say. I may say a little bit about it later, because this idea was rejected. And Wyndham turned to develop this idea, which came to him when he saw a large plant being shaken in the breeze in a hedgerow, and he offered The Day of the Triffids. And for those who haven't read it, it begins when the narrator, Bill Mason, is wakening in hospital on the day the bandages are to be removed after his eyes have been damaged by a triffid sting. Is he going to be blind or not? And one of the first sort of ironies of the story is that he can see, but the rest of the world can't. So what are triffids? Well, triffids are large, mobile, carnivorous plants of mysterious origin, probably developed by Russian biologists, but scattered around the world after an attempt to steal the seeds has failed and the plane carrying the seeds has been shot down. Their oil has become essential. They are what this future world relies on. They're potentially deadly because of their stings, but they're farmed in secure environments. Now, the night before, what seems to be a meteor storm has lit up the sky. And Bill wakens, he takes off his bandages because no doctors are coming. It's eerily silent. He and a few others who didn't see the light in the sky can see, but the rest of the people who did see the lights, have been blinded. And so Bill and a few other survivors have to exist in a world which has fallen apart, and the advantage that people have over Triffids, that we can see them coming, has gone. When Triffids escape, they find easy pickings among the panicking blind people, to whom there's sudden death appearing out of nowhere in the dark. And like H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds, a safe, complacent society is undermined by a threat for which they're not prepared. And so here we have an example of panicking people in the centre of London, discovering blindness. And if you look closely at that picture, you will see the advert for Bovril still around in this future, the great science fiction food. So the story was originally published under the title Revolt of the Triffids in Collier's Weekly in 1951. And it developed a sense of unease right from the confusion of time in the first sentence. Take it from me, when a day that you happen to know is Wednesday starts off by sounding like Sunday, there is something wrong somewhere. And interestingly, the Wyndham archive contains a typescript in which there's a different opening sentence. On the day when the great calamity put an end to the world that I had known for almost 30 years, I happened to be in bed with a bandage all around my head and over my eyes. Now, I think that's much weaker than what Wyndham eventually decided upon. It reminds me, Wyndham's opening reminds me very much of the famous George Orwell thing, when he starts off 1984 by saying the clocks were striking 13, and you immediately think there's something odd there, and you want to read the novel to find out what this how this odd thing is going to develop. So The Day the Triffids became one of the best-known science fiction novels of all time, Penguin classic, adapted for radio, film and television. As I was saying earlier, I first heard it when I was about 8 or 9 over the radio. Here are a couple of examples: a Hungarian version, French version, I think a Norwegian version, and the famous or the later Penguin classic version. And it was a film in 1963. It's also been filmed by the BBC twice, most recently with a version starring Eddie Izzard. The 1963 version, how can I say, it's been criticised for its irrelevant subplot, an absurd ending. They discovered when they made it that it was too short, and they had to tack on an entire irrelevant subplot about 2 people in a lighthouse besieged by Triffids. It was well reviewed at the time. I have to say that it contains 2 absolutely brilliant scenes which really make up for the weakness of the rest. Now, I'm not going to describe them. I'm not, this is spoiler territory here. I'm just going to say that there are 2 scenes in it which I think rocked me back on my seat and thought, this is serious stuff. So, if you want to find it, I'm sure track it down. But what do I think of Wyndham? Why do I think he's important? This story, I think, is part of it. It's a short story published in the magazine Fantastic. Now to kind of look back a little bit, and again, this is a little bit literary history, but it possibly worth pointing out. John Osborne's play Look Back in Anger, it's supposed to have kicked off this movement of exploration of post-war British English discontent and ambivalence in a movement which people called the angry young men. Now, I think before that, there was John Wyndham. Now, John Wyndham was not particularly angry. He was not even particularly young at the time. He was nearly 50 when The Day of the Triffids was published. If he was angry at all, it was in that kind of speciously journalistic way in which writers who've really got nothing in common are linked together as a sort of movement. What he was, I think, was a sort of typically disillusioned conservative after the trauma of World War II. Disillusioned. His somewhat chaotic life after his parents' separation and his adult life as a writer living in the Pen Club next door to Grace Wilson, whom he eventually married in 1963, do, I think, suggest that someone who felt a little bit trapped by circumstance. He regarded his school days at Bedales as one of the stable times of his life. David Kettler, who draws upon an unpublished reminiscence of Wyndham by his brother Vivian, says that Bedale was Wyndham's idea of utopia, and I think that's kind of quite right. But in the 1950s, war-torn Britain, scarred by the war and the stresses of recovery, was no Bedales. And Confidence Trick, I think, is a story that explains this. A group of passengers on the London Underground kind of end up in this stereotyped shoddy hell, and they escape from this when one of the characters kind of looks around and expresses his disbelief in such nonsense, and they end up back on the surface of the earth in London. And the same character stares up at the Bank of England, and he's just about to sort of articulate something, and the ground shakes, and before he can express his disbelief, he's pushed under a bus. And the character who pushes him underneath is expressing his dismay at his undermining of the tradition of heaven and hell. There simply cannot be any stability if we do not respect our institutions. You, young man, have destroyed one. We all had confidence in this affair, even you to begin with. Then you suddenly go and break it all up. An institution of considerable standing, too. No, I really cannot be expected to approve of that. And what Wyndham's suggesting in this story, and more seriously in The Day of the Triffids and Midwit's Cuckoos and a number of his other novels, is that we cannot rely on the stability of our institutions. Religion, politics, economic systems, they all depend on us buying into their stories and suspending our disbelief. Now, as I mentioned, the pulp writer John Bainton Harris have been described as one of the best of our modern science fiction writers. His reinvention as a novelist of what he was to call logical fantasy was partly a marketing strategy, I think, but partly arose from dissatisfaction with the current state of science fiction. Stanislav Lem, the Polish science fiction writer, called him a huckster. And there's certainly something deliberate in what he was doing. The Day of the Triffids was part of a process in which he was revisioning his idea of science fiction. And this resulted in Plan for Chaos, which he tried to imitate the tone of the hard-boiled detective story and fooled his readers into continuing with this science fiction tale. He created a male character, Johnny Farthing, whose uncertain background. He's a British man of Norwegian ancestry who has emigrated to the United States and is very much trying to be more American than the American. He's talking in this fake, hard-boiled American slangy language that was probably fake even to readers in the 1950s, if they ever saw it, which they didn't. And that uncertainty, I think, possibly reflects Wyndham's own uncertainty. But this uncertainty also was more successfully, I think, covered in the Triffids, which became an enduring classic among readers who didn't normally read science fiction. Many readers and reviewers thought it was the first novel. Maybe it was. So this is kind of my literary critic bit. I think as a number of as novel ideas, it rests on three things. First, there's the relationship between Bill Mason, who's an entirely normal 1950s Englishman in a changed future. This is the future, but it's like most science fiction futures. It's firmly rooted in the present, experienced by its readers. Bill Mason's relationship with Gisela Clayton, the first survivor he meets. And he realizes he's aware of her, or he has known of her, as the author of a controversial novel called Sex is My Adventure. And Gisela is the first of Wyndham's major female characters. She's a woman striking along her own path who sees the world more clearly than Wyndham, and who realizes that so-called universal values must be questioned when the social order is disrupted. Now, reading that, I think we kind of notice that Wyndham backs off at times. Despite the title of what they call her silly, shocking book, Sex is not necessarily her adventure. And she's still quicker thinking than Wyndham. She's the one who, when Torrance, this character who is trying to set up what eventually looks like a neo-fascist military dictatorship, when he's saying that the sighted men should take on one or more blind women to kind of get the population going. Bill is a kind of bit iffy about that, but Gisela says, "Don't worry, dear, I'll choose you two nice girls." Despite that kind of sense of being a bit more in control than he is, she does revert back to domesticity in the end, but her voice is never quite silenced. Secondly, there's Coker. Coker is the third major character. He's a kind of moral chorus to the others. He's a working class hybrid. He's kind of out of his class, like John Wyndham was, although he's from the opposite end of the class spectrum. There's this suggestion that his mother was working class, but his father was some sort of toff. And again, he's a voice for a kind of proto-feminism, but he's often wrong-headed. He goes completely nuts when these women in this community say that they don't know how to work an electric generator because that is men's work. And yeah, he is Mr. Insensitive when he's trying to deal with that. But like Gisela, he's capable of changing his mind and understanding that drastically changed circumstances require different solutions. Now, third, there's the extended metaphor of blindness. And now the Triffids exploit actual blindness caused by the random intrusion of comets or the breakdown of satellite defense systems. We're left to choose on that one. What creates catastrophe in Triffids is neither the satellites nor the bioengineering, but the combination of the two. They slip from humanity's control And so there's this whole morass of unintended consequences. Like in the Midwich Cuckoos, we never really hear about the origin and nature of the mysterious children. So we never hear the full story. We can bring our own fears to it. And this is why I think Triffids is once a story about Cold War anxieties and nuclear weapons. And I think it's become read nowadays more as a novel to express our fears about genetic manipulation. So, the title of this was John Wyndham and the Cosy Catastrophe. Well, the Cosy Catastrophe was a term coined by the British author Brian Aldiss to describe what he called the kind of disaster novel in which the essence is that the hero should have a pretty good time, a girl, free sweets at the Savoy, automobiles for the taking, while everyone is taking off. Everyone else is dying off, sorry. And he pointed to the Day of the Triffids as one of the classic examples of this. And he later championed other British disaster novels. These are a few, particularly John Christopher's The Death of Grass. I don't know if anyone's ever read that. It's a very good novel. It's much darker in many ways than Day of the Triffids. Now, there's certainly something in this. Certainly Bill and Gisela have a romantic night drinking fine wines in a luxury apartment filled with every amount of luxury, up to and including the bed and the bath, with significantly positioned mirrors in the ceiling on top of them. But after they enter what they call the zenith or nadir of decadence, Bill notices a couple leaving, and that's a high-rise apartment. And I'll read this. It's a little long, but I think it's quite interesting. As I stepped outside, another door further down the passage opened. I stopped and stood still where I was. A young man came out, leading a fair-haired girl by the hand. As she stepped over the threshold, he released his grasp. "Wait just a minute, darling," he said. He took 3 or 4 steps on the silencing carpet. His outstretched hands found the window which ended the passage. His fingers went straight to the catch and opened it. I had a glimpse of a fire escape outside. "What are you doing, Jimmy?" she asked. "Just making sure," he said, stepping quickly back to her and feeling for her hand again. "Come along, darling." She hung back. "Jimmy, I don't like leaving here. At least we know where we are in our own flat. How are we going to feed? How are we going to live?" "In the flat, darling, we shan't feed at all and therefore not live long. Come along, sweetheart. Don't be afraid." "But I am, Jimmy. I am." She clung to him and he put one arm round her. "We'll be all right, darling. Come along." "But Jimmy, that's the wrong way." "You've got it twisted round here. It's the right way." "Jimmy, I'm so frightened. Let's go back." "It's too late, darling." By the window, he paused. With one hand, he felt his position very carefully. Then he put both arms round her, holding her to him. "Too wonderful to last, perhaps," he said. "I love you, my sweet. I love you so very, very much." She turned her lips up to be kissed. As he lifted her, he turned and stepped out of the window. Now, I think that's brutal and sentimental at the same time. And I think that brutality and sentimentality really unsettles Bill, and it unsettles the reader, I think, who thinks about it. Later on, after their romantic meal, Bill and Gisela retire to bed separately, just to reassure any 1950s readers with moral qualms. Bill's prudishness is really one of the amusing parts of the whole thing. And their actual sexual encounter after Gisela, wearing the sort of garment that could have belonged only to the owner of that remarkable bedroom, thus disturbing the poor man even more, has awakened Bill to tell him that she's noticed a light that can only be more survivors. It only comes after each has been brought to breaking point by the terror and despair going on around them. Bill says, "I lay awake for an hour or more. Night magnified the quiet of the city, making the sounds which broke it more desolate. From time to time, voices from the street sharp and brittle with hysteria. Once there was a freezing scream which seemed to revel horribly in its release from sanity. Somewhere not far away there was a sobbing that went on endlessly, hopelessly. Twice I heard the sharp reports of single pistol shots. So, Cosy? I don't think so. I hope I haven't disturbed anybody too much by reading those episodes. But Cosy they are not. John Wyndham became popular because his novels slipped down so well, and he developed a style that appealed to a kind of middle-brow reader. Interestingly, the reviews of the day of the Triffids and science fiction press are sometimes much more guarded, as if to say, this is an okay novel, but we've read it all before. In some ways they have, but Wyndham was not aiming at the hardcore science fiction market. His novels appeared for a long time on school syllabuses, possibly because they were easy to read, full of thrills and monsters, but not that lurid science fiction trash. Wyndham himself criticised space opera. He preferred the term logical fantasy to define his works and what he wrote, at least what he wrote on the blurb, or what the publishers wrote on the blurb. I'm pretty sure that it is him, that his work was a modified form of what is unhappily called science fiction. When we get to the heart of what he was writing, there is, as I've tried to suggest, a bleakness which it's easy to overlook. So Wyndham's science fiction novels express the anxieties of the early 1950s in a way no realistic novel ever could. This is my defense of science fiction over the realistic novel, by the way. Other writers use this technique. William Golding's Lord of the Flies in 1954 drew upon the science fiction disaster story. The first chapter, which was unpublished, Golding was persuaded, possibly rightly, to leave the first chapter unpublished. But the first chapter of Lord of the Flies makes it quite clear that the children are escaping from a nuclear catastrophe. British writers from H.G. Wells to Golding and Sidney Fowler Wright had already explored the collapse of civilization, but Wyndham made the monsters and aliens of science fiction pulp nightmares about the world. He says more about the complacency of his times, I think, than his literary rivals. And in some of his other novels, the fears of a new, strange generation shattering conventional morality, foreshadowed by the children of sleepy Midwich in the Midwich Cuckoos, or the post-neural anxieties of the chrysalids' shattered landscapes. In Cuckoos, the children's destruction is the only solution to the threat that they pose. The ruthless Soviets have already destroyed their children, but the British state, which claims to be more humanitarian, and which, we're aware, Wyndham's 1950s readership were well aware, had just won a war against a regime which was trying to do exactly that, can't justify that sort of genocide. But can an individual take the responsibility? And that's really disturbing now in the case of suicide bombing and things like that. There's a bitter taste at that sort of thing, but it's a taste that Wyndham worked very hard to create. So in these dilemmas, Wyndham's readers were wrestling with ideas which came very much to the fore during the Second World War and which really have not gone away, I think. Triffids begins with a suspicion that there's something seriously wrong somewhere, but it's not the monstrous shambling plants that are wrong. And while his novels remain entertaining, even now slightly old-fashioned, I think they still leave us uneasy, wondering why Wednesday sounds like Sunday. And that, I think, is where I shall end off, and hope that I have not scared people too much.
Well, thank you very much, Andy, for that. You brought back a lot of memories, because it's a long time since I've read these books. If anybody's got any questions for Andy, can you either use the ask a question button, or can you put them in the comments at the side? Meanwhile, I have 2 confessions to make. I remember being caught in a storm with lots of lights flashing around the horizon, and feeling this desperate urge to keep my eyes shut just in case it was the day of the Triffids. Yes. So I would have been about 20 maybe then. Yeah. So I remember doing that. And my other confession is I actually preferred the Midwich Cuckoos. But yes. So we've got a couple of comments here.
Midwich Cuckoos is possibly my favourite, but Triffids is great.
I didn't grow up in the 50s. I'm slightly younger than you, so I missed all those 50s nuances of the novels, and you've just highlighted that for me. So thank you very much.
Well, it's sort of post 50s, really. It's I mean late 50s, but we're when I got to it. But these anxieties about the Cold War really kind of go through way well. I mean, in a way, they're still not over. It's just a Cold War with a different.
We just move the goalposts all the time. There's this constant fear of something, and in some cases, some governments use that constant fear of something to keep their population squashed down. Really. So we've got a quote from Sue Proctor, who says, well, my reading list just got a bit longer. Thanks for another great morning.
Thank you.
Robert Davis says, fantastic, thank you. And David Harrison says, great talk, Andy, really enjoyed it. And Hazel Phillips says, thank you, great talk. Now need to search out my copy. My copy, I'm afraid, went to the charity shop last time I moved house. So, But the bit about where the couple, where the young man took his wife out of the window, that really made the hairs stand up on the back of my neck. It was really.
I think it. If you look at stuff like that, Wyndham knew the effect he was trying to get. Just a sort of an anecdote, really. My wife doesn't like science fiction at all. When we got married, and I had sort of closer access to her book collection, we had, I think, 2 books in common. One of them was The Day of the Triffids. I think this might actually be my wife's copy. No, it's not actually, but we still have 2 copies.
So it was one of the things she had written. Well, thanks for doing that once again. Mal and Graham say thanks, Andy, really enjoyed that. And I won't be here next month, and neither will Andy, but Jackie says, super, Andy, great context for someone who has never read any science fiction, rushing out to get a copy. It did. I think I read most of these when I was probably about 15, 16. I followed them on from 1984 and Brave New World and got hooked and read science fiction for a long time and then grew out of it, I'm afraid. But I might just slide back into it again.
Yes, they are good novels. I mean, that's why they were taught in schools for a long while. They're good novels for teenagers without getting particularly controversial in terms of sexual matters or anything like that. And yet there are still a lot of ideas in them for discussion.
Okay. Well, I'm going to end the broadcast now, and thank you very much for doing it. And it will be going out to all the members later. Those of you that have been in the live talk, please recommend it to other people.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for listening, guys. And yes.